The courtroom went silent when Officer Barnes slammed the cuffs on Elias Reed, a black man who once stood on the other side of that bench as a respected prosecutor. Gasps filled the room. Some stared in disbelief. Others looked away in shame. The same system he once defended was now tearing him down in front of everyone. But when the heavy doors burst open and the governor himself walked in, everything changed. If this moment makes your heart tighten, hit like and share this story, because what happens next will redefine justice forever. I remember the heat first, not the weather, the heat of eyes, cameras blinking like gnats, shoes scraping marble, the seal of Fulton County glinting above the bench as if it had nothing to apologize for. Then the doors parted and they brought him in. Elias Reed. Cuffs on a man who used to walk these halls without a guard in sight. A black man in a tired suit and a sky blue tie, chin-level wrists crossed. He didn't pull, he didn't plead. He just scanned the room once the way a surgeon checks a tray before the cut. You could feel some folks shrink. Others, mostly the deputies, stretch taller the way men do when they think the moment belongs to them. I'd seen him years ago at a press conference when he was still a federal prosecutor, voice low, careful with words, careful with facts. Today the facts felt like they belonged to somebody else. Reporters craned for a clean shot. The woman beside me clutched her purse with both hands like truth might spill out of it. They sat him at the defense table. The cuffs stayed. He lifted his eyes to the gold letters behind the judge. "In God we trust," and something passed across his face. Not a smile. Something thinner. I couldn't name it. Restraint, maybe. Or the tensile wire of disappointment pulled just tight enough not to snap. Case number 22A-117, State of Georgia versus Elias Jerome Reed, the clerk said, bored and brisk. Every syllable sounded like a door closing. Judge Clarkson scanned the docket as if it offended him personally. He looked at Reed the way you look at a stain on a shirt you can't change out of. "Counsel ready?" he asked, already knowing his own answer. From the row behind the prosecution rose Officer Kurt Barnes, new haircut, fresh jawline, the kind of posture that wants to be saluted. He wasn't lead counsel. He wasn't counsel at all. He was a witness wearing a uniform like a verdict. When Reed turned and saw him, he didn't flinch. Barnes smiled with only one side of his mouth. The prosecutor read the charges in a tone that did not require proof, obstruction of an internal inquiry, mishandling of evidence, unauthorized disclosure. As each item landed, you could hear a hum gather in the room. Not words, just the friction of people deciding what to think. Reed's lawyer tried to stand and object to the cuffs, but Clarkson waved him down without looking. "We'll get to theatrics later," the judge said, and his gavel tapped once like a cough he didn't want to claim. Across the aisle, a white-haired reporter whispered, "He was one of the good ones." "How do we get here?" The woman next to me answered under her breath, "Same road we've always taken." Neither of them looked at each other. Reed folded his hands and stared straight ahead. When the prosecutor called him a man who betrayed his oath, Barnes's smile lifted a millimeter. Reed's jaw moved once and then settled. He didn't reach for the microphone. He didn't ask to be heard. If silence has a posture, that was it. I expected anger. I got something colder. Contempt has a smell to it, cleaner than sweat, more clinical than fear. It was in the way some spectators leaned back, as if Reed might toss his guilt like a coat over their laps. It was in the bailiff's eyes, fixed not on the man, but on the cuffs, like the metal itself proved something logic never could. Clarkson cleared his throat. "Let's proceed without delay." The prosecutor stepped into the center like a dancer who finally got his music back, began telling the jury who Reed was now, not who he'd been. A former federal prosecutor who thought the rules did not apply to him. He let that hang. The words former and rules did the quiet damage. Barnes shifted, checking who was watching him watch Reed. He'd been under Reed once under investigation if rumors had bones. Now he stood above him, the badge on his chest bright as a coin. He leaned forward to whisper as he passed the defense table, too low for the microphones, just loud enough for the first 3 rows. "You'll never win again, Reed." For a beat, the room tightened. Reed turned his head the smallest degree. "I'm not here to win," he said, voice soft enough to make you lean in, steady enough to make you stop. "I'm here to remind you what justice used to mean." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The line hit like the click before a shell seats in the chamber. Somewhere in the back, a pen dropped and rolled under a bench. Someone's phone vibrated and nobody reached for it. Clarkson pretended not to hear. "Save your statements for testimony," he said, but his eyes flicked to the press row measuring the damage. The prosecutor coughed into a smile and resumed painting Reed as a man who meddled, who leaked, who wanted headlines more than law. The story sounded ready-made, ironed flat for the evening news. I kept looking at Reed. The way he rested his fingertips on the table, not clenched, not splayed. The way he breathed long and longer, out like a swimmer counting tiles at the bottom of a pool. Now and then he wrote something on a small black notebook, 3 words at a time, and closed it with care. He didn't pass notes to his lawyer. He didn't look at the gallery to search for believers. He was sitting inside a storm and taking its measure. During a recess, he stood. The deputies bracketed him as if gravity might forget him. When he turned, he came shoulder to shoulder with Barnes in the aisle. They paused in that half-second men use to decide whether to nod or headbutt. Barnes filled the beat. "Still playing the noble act," he murmured. "No act," Reed said. "Just a memory." Barnes's lips thinned. "You ruined my career once," he said louder, as if volume could bleach the pettiness out of the sentence. "You ruined your own," Reed answered, not loud, not kind. "The day you stopped seeing people as people." It wasn't a shout, it was worse. It was true enough to sting and simple enough to remember. You could feel the gallery lean in on instinct, like people at a window when thunder doesn't follow the lightning right away. The bailiff barked that recess was over. The jurors filed in with the baffled solemnity of strangers at a family funeral. On the wall behind the judge, the flag barely moved in the conditioned air, as if even cloth was thinking about the weight of its colors. Reed sat again. Barnes reclaimed his place in the front row, a little too square, a little too still. Clarkson looked at the clock, then at nothing, then at the clerk. The prosecutor shuffled his papers for the sake of shuffling. The room seemed to wait for something it didn't want, like a diagnosis the body has already felt, but the mind refuses to say out loud. That's when I noticed the smallest thing, Reed's cuff chain, resting against the wood, bright and obvious, and his thumb not trying to hide it. He wasn't fighting the picture of himself they wanted. He was letting it hang there, daring the room to decide whether metal makes a man. I wish I could tell you the judge found his better nature right then. He didn't. I wish I could tell you someone stood to say the obvious. No one did. The air pressed down and we all pretended it was just the weather. But a story can turn in a breath. And whether you believe in providence or protocol, something was already moving toward those doors, the kind of movement that makes even contempt step aside. We didn't know it yet. Reed did. You could see it in the way he straightened his shoulders as if he'd heard footsteps no one else could hear. He looked up at the words above the bench one more time. This time he didn't flinch. When court resumed, the air felt heavier, like everyone had agreed to breathe less. The prosecutor's voice sliced through the stillness, reading off the charges one by one, savoring each word like it was a victory. Obstruction of internal investigation, unauthorized disclosure of confidential information, conduct unbecoming of a federal officer. Every line landed like a stone dropped into deep water. No splash, just weight. Across the aisle, a white reporter whispered to his colleague. He was one of the good ones. "How did it come to this?" His voice cracked halfway through as if he didn't quite believe his own question. Elias Reed didn't answer, didn't even blink. He sat perfectly still, hands folded, eyes locked on the prosecutor, as if he were studying a machine he'd once built and now couldn't recognize. His silence filled the room in a way words couldn't. Judge Clarkson leaned back, tapping his pen against the desk, cutting off Reed's lawyer whenever he spoke. "Move on, counselor. Spare us the speeches." The defense tried again, motioning to remove the cuffs, but Clarkson's gavel hit the block before the man could finish. Denied. Barnes sat in the front row beside the prosecution, arms crossed, smirking just enough to be seen. You could tell he was enjoying this, watching the man who once investigated him, now sitting in chains. Every few minutes he'd glance toward Elias, waiting for him to crack. Elias never gave him the satisfaction. A woman in the back row leaned forward, whispering to no one in particular, "They're not judging him. They're judging all of us." Heads turned her way. No one shushed her. No one dared. Elias finally reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black notebook. He opened it, wrote 3 slow words, and closed it again. I was close enough to see what it said when he set it down beside him. The louder they lie, the quieter truth becomes. The bailiff glanced over but didn't move. Even he looked unsure which side of history he was standing on. Barnes's smirk faltered for just a second when he saw Elias write that. Maybe it reminded him of the old days back when Reed's notes could end a career. He leaned forward, whispered something to the prosecutor, who nodded without looking up. The judge cleared his throat. "Mr. Reed, do you have anything to say in your defense?" For a long second it seemed he might. The room leaned forward as one. But Elias only lifted his eyes, calm and steady. "I've said enough," he replied softly. Clarkson scoffed. "That's convenient." Barnes chuckled under his breath. And that's when something shifted. Not in the case, not in the evidence. Something in the room itself. The silence changed shape. It wasn't fear anymore. It was pressure. You could feel it pushing back like the air had grown teeth. The journalist from earlier lowered his camera. The woman in the back straightened her spine. Even the bailiff stopped fidgeting. Reed sat unmoving, the light from the high window falling across his face. His eyes weren't pleading. They were remembering. I realized then that his silence wasn't weakness, it was armor. Every insult, every accusation, every crooked smirk that hit him was another arrow blunted against it. When the prosecutor rested his case for the day, Clarkson didn't even look up. "Court adjourned until morning," he said, already gathering his papers. No one stood. No one clapped or coughed or shuffled their feet. Because deep down, we all knew something was off. Justice had been bent before our eyes, and nobody was sure if it would ever stand straight again. The recess bell hadn't even finished echoing when Elias stood. The soft clink of his cuffs was the only sound that dared to move. He stepped into the hallway, a long, pale tunnel of marble and dust, where the light came thin and tired through narrow windows. The air hummed with the kind of silence that comes before something breaks. He paused beneath a sign that read, "For authorized personnel," only as if even space had rules for who could breathe freely here. Then a voice cut through behind him, sharp, familiar, soaked in mockery. Still pretending to be the noble one, Officer Barnes. His boots hit the floor like hammers, his tone dripping with satisfaction. Elias didn't turn right away. When he did, his voice was calm, stripped of heat. "Pretending, no. That's your job." The words were quiet, but they landed hard. Barnes took another step, eyes narrowing. His smirk thinned into something uglier. "You ruined my career once. Now I'll make sure you never stand again." Elias' reply came low, almost gentle, like a cut made with a clean blade. "You ruined your own career the day you stopped seeing people as human." That sentence froze the air between them. Barnes's face reddened. A pulse jumped in his neck. "You think that badge on your old desk made you better than me?" Elias didn't answer. He didn't have to. His silence said more than anger ever could. And that silence, that refusal to kneel, to flinch, to feed the hate, made Barnes snap. He shoved Elias hard. The sound of the impact flesh wall metal rang out like a slap to the whole building. Elias stumbled but didn't fall all the way. His shoulder hit the marble, his wrist twisting painfully in the cuffs as he caught himself. Gasps filled the corridor. A black woman in a floral dress shouted from down the hall. "Stop! He didn't do anything!" Barnes spun on her, voice cracking like a whip. "Back off! He's resisting arrest." "Resisting!" she shouted back. "He's standing still." But Barnes wasn't hearing anything except his own fury. He lunged again, forcing Elias to the ground. The man never swung back. He didn't even speak. The marble floor took the blow for him. Two deputies rushed out from the courtroom. One of them, Deputy Hale, froze when he saw who was on the floor. "Kurt, what the hell are you doing? He's under arrest," Barnes barked. "Assault on an officer. He didn't touch you," Hale shouted, stepping closer. Barnes ignored him. He yanked Elias's arms behind his back and snapped the cuffs tighter. Click, click. The sound echoed, sharp, final. Then the hallway exploded with camera flashes. Reporters swarmed, shouting over each other. "Get the angle, zoom in." That's the shot through it all. Elias stayed silent. He didn't struggle. He didn't plead. His breathing was steady, eyes open and clear. When he finally looked up, he didn't look at Barnes. He looked past him, through him, like he was seeing something far older than this hallway. "History repeats itself," he said softly. "Only the uniforms change." The woman in the dress covered her mouth. Hale turned away, shaking his head. Even the cameras hesitated for a moment, as if ashamed of what they were capturing. Barnes stepped back, chest heaving. The red in his face wasn't just anger, now it was fear, the kind that comes when the crowd stops cheering. Elias rose slowly, the chain between his cuffs catching the light. The marble shone around him bright and cold like a stage built for humiliation. I remember standing there frozen as the world seemed to hold its breath. Because it wasn't just about Elias anymore. It was about every man and woman who'd ever been told to stay quiet, every truth bent beneath a badge. That's when it hit me, the sound those cuffs made. It wasn't noise. It was history echoing through metal. The narrator's voice dropped low, almost whispering, "Injustice doesn't always wear a hood. Sometimes it wears a badge." Barnes grabbed Elias by the arm and dragged him toward the holding room. The chain rattled like a ghost. Cameras kept clicking, each flash a nail in the coffin of decency, and as they disappeared through the heavy doors, the echoes followed metal footsteps. Silence. The sound of dignity breaking. And whether anyone would admit it or not, we all heard it. Barnes hauled Elias down the corridor like he was late to his own punishment. The chain bit and flashed. A thin seam of blood trailed from Elias's wrist, bright against the steel, but his chin stayed level, as if posture were the last border no one could cross. "Easy," I muttered, without meaning to. The word went nowhere. Marble doesn't carry mercy. Deputy Hale jogged to catch up, breath tight. "Kurt, stop." He's not resisting. Barnes didn't break stride. He's resisting by breathing. The sentence hit the hallway like a bad joke no one wanted to laugh at. Hale's face folded. Shame looks a lot like nausea when it's fresh. He glanced at Elias, then at the cameras trailing behind us in a broken constellation. "This isn't procedure," he said, smaller now. Elias turned his head just enough that his words would land clean. "If my calm bothers you," he said, voice even, "maybe it's not me you hate, it's yourself." Hale's gaze dropped. Barnes yanked the chain. They reached the heavy door to holding painted a municipal gray, so permanent it felt like policy. Barnes fumbled his key card, swore under his breath, then slammed the plate with his shoulder. The door released with a mechanical sigh. He shoved Elias through. The cuffs scraped the frame. That sound was a spark down my spine. Inside the room was a box cinder block, walls a bench bolted to the floor, a camera in the corner pretending to be shy. Barnes spun Elias, pushed him down to sit, then stepped back as if proximity might stain him. "Stay put," he said, loud enough for the hallway to hear. Power always needs an audience. The door swung shut on a hinge that knew too much. The latch caught, and the final clack rang out a period at the end of someone else's sentence. If humiliation has an echo, it sounds like that. For a beat, we all just stood there, Mihail. A pair of junior deputies, two reporters who'd forgotten to breathe. Through the narrow window, I could see Elias alone on the bench. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, hands still cuffed behind him, and let his head hang for the first time. Not in defeat, in inventory. Like a diver at the edge of black water, deciding how long the lungs can hold. He lifted his face to the light slicing under the door. Dust drifted in the beam, turning seconds into visible things. He spoke not loud, not for us, just to make the truth audible to himself. "They can cage my body," he whispered. "Not my truth." I don't know if the mic caught it. I know I did. Hale rubbed his jaw, staring at the floor like it owed him an apology. "This isn't right," he said again, quieter, as if trying the words on to see if they fit. Barnes rolled his eyes. "What's not right," Barnes snapped, "is treating him like he's special. He made his bed." Hale shot back, unexpected fire in it. "We made it for him." Barnes looked at the window at the man on the bench who wouldn't vanish. "Save the poetry," he muttered, then marched off his anger, needing distance to breathe. The camera in the corner blinked once, a tiny red heartbeat, and then went still. I stayed. I don't know why. Maybe because leaving felt like agreeing. Through the glass, Elias straightened. He took a slow breath, shoulders lifting, shoulders settling. He turned his wrists, subtly testing how much the cuffs would allow. Not much. Enough to remind a man of bones. He glanced up toward the ceiling lens and didn't look away. If dignity has a way of staring, that was it. Patient, unashamed, unwilling to barter. The light under the door warmed a shade, the small daily miracle of afternoon. He watched it like a clock. I kept replaying the corridor, Barnes's shove, the stunned chorus, the woman's cry, the double click of the cuffs. Shame is heavier when you have nowhere to set it down. In that little rectangle of glass, I could see a country inside a man and a man inside a cage. Both were too familiar. Down the hall, a bailiff hurried past with a stack of files. Paper always looks busy when justice is stalled. Voices seeped from the courtroom, low, careful, professional. The building returned to its regular pulse as if it hadn't just watched itself lose face. Judge Clarkson came out of chambers with two clerks in tow, eyes fixed on a point above everyone's heads, somewhere, safe somewhere, without witnesses. He saw the reporters, saw me, saw Hale, and then studied the exit sign like it was an interesting statute. He adjusted his robe, cleared his throat, and walked on. Courage doesn't always fail loudly. Hale watched him go, a small, sick smile on his mouth. Gonna pretend he didn't hear anything he said. Like furniture. Like furniture, I echoed. The words tasted like dust. Inside, Elias lowered his gaze to the strip of light again. I could almost hear what he was doing, putting pieces into their boxes, labeling pain-shelving rage, leaving room for the one thing men like him run on when the oxygen thins purpose. He flexed his fingers once behind his back, a tiny movement you could miss if you wanted to. I didn't. He said nothing else. He didn't need to. The room said enough, the bolt, the block, the weight of a door designed to make people forget their names. Barnes reappeared with a clipboard and a temper more organized than before. Transport form, he told Hale, not looking up. Bureaucracy is where cruelty goes to feel clean. Hale took the pen, didn't move. Kurt, he said, keeping his voice level. I'm logging that you tightened the cuffs after control was established. Barnes laughed, short, bright, brittle. Log a poem while you're at it. I'm logging it, Hale repeated and wrote. It wasn't courage with a trumpet. It was a seed. I watched it fall into the dirt of the moment and disappear. Through the glass, Elias closed his eyes, listening to footsteps, to paper, to the small negotiations men make with themselves when no one is clapping. He exhaled slowly. I realized then that composure isn't the absence of pain. It's the decision not to share it with your enemies. Somewhere behind us, the courthouse doors boomed and the sound traveled like weather. People noticed thunder. They missed barometric pressure. But you could feel that too, the slow change, the shift. A draft slid under the holding room door and tugged at the dust like a quiet invitation. I looked back toward the courtroom. Clarkson had vanished. The prosecutor argued with an empty hallway. A reporter checked his phone and cursed softly. The building felt anticipatory. Like a choir drawing breath before a note it wasn't sure it could reach. Hale capped the pen, set the clipboard on a ledge, and stepped to the glass. He met Elias's eyes through the reflection of his own badge. I should have stopped him, he said. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Confessions rarely do. Elias nodded once, not unkind. Mercy can be economical. Barnes slapped the clipboard with his palm. We're done here. He jerked his chin at the door. Open it. Hale hesitated, then keyed the panel. The lock thunked, a heavy practice sound. Barnes reached for the handle. I don't know what made me step back. Maybe the same pressure that had been building since morning. Maybe the sense that the day had decided to turn and was looking for a place to pivot. The door began to swing. The strip of light widened across the floor, drawing a clean, bright line to Elias's shoes. He straightened, not taller, just true. Sometimes dignity must fall before it can rise again. I had said that to myself in the courtroom as an excuse for watching. Here it felt like a promise with a deadline. Because whatever waited beyond that door wasn't just more of the same. The air said so. The dust said so. Even the cameras, sleeping one blink at a time, seemed to know their next flash would mean something different. Elias rolled his shoulders once the smallest reset. He lifted his chin. And as the door fully opened and the light laid itself at his feet, we all leaned toward the corridor, toward the murmur gathering at its far end, toward the sound of a city changing its mind. We didn't have a word for it yet, but we would. Inside the holding room, the noise from the hallway died, just a hum of fluorescent lights and the soft buzz of a cheap security camera. Barnes closed the door behind him and dropped his voice, that smug half-whisper men use when they think the walls belong to them. He motioned for Elias to empty his pockets. When Elias didn't move fast enough, Barnes did it for him, hands rough, impatient, searching like the act itself could prove a point. He pulled out a folded wallet, a pen, a worn notebook, then paused at the sight of a small black government-issued phone. The screen lit up on its own. Governor's office, incoming secure transmission. Barnes froze. The words blinked in green bright against the dark screen. For a moment, all that confidence on his face cracked. Then he laughed short and forced. "Calling the governor to save you. That's cute." Elias lifted his head slowly. His voice came quiet, but it filled the room. "He's not coming for me. He's coming for justice." Barnes's smile faltered. He pressed the button to end the transmission, but the phone refused to respond, the words still glowing. From the corner, Deputy Hale stepped closer, eyes narrowing. "Hold up," Hale murmured. "That's not a regular line." Barnes frowned. "What are you talking about?" Hale pointed to the lower corner of the screen, a symbol, a faint golden seal. "That's an encrypted state code," he said. "Governor-level clearance. I've seen that once before on an interagency brief. You shouldn't even be touching that." Barnes straightened, but his voice stayed low and tense. "He's bluffing. That thing could belong to anyone." Elias gave a quiet breath, not quite a laugh. "When truth calls," he said, "even the powerful answer." For a second, no one spoke. You could hear the tick of the ventilation unit, the hum of electricity. Hale's eyes darted between the phone and Elias's calm expression. Then, faint but unmistakable, a siren sounded in the distance. Not the frantic kind that means danger, but the heavy, steady pitch of official escorts cutting through traffic. The sound rolled closer, gathering weight. Hale looked toward the narrow window slit high on the wall. "Barnes," he whispered, "listen to that." Barnes shook his head, forced a scoff that didn't stick. Coincidence. Courthouse gets motorcades all the time. But the sound grew engines, the thrum of tires, a single low horn signaling authority. Someone important was coming. The deputies exchanged glances. Even the camera's red light blinked twice like it was paying attention. Barnes threw the phone onto the metal table, the clang too loud in the small room. "Enough of this," he muttered, but his voice was tighter now. "He's playing mind games." Elias didn't respond. He sat straighter, eyes on the wall, as if listening to something none of them could hear. The corner of his mouth lifted just slightly. Outside, the rumble deepened. Hale stepped back from the door, uneasy. "That's not a courthouse escort," he said. "That's the governor's convoy." Barnes turned sharply. "How the hell would you know?" Hale's reply came quiet, almost apologetic. "Because I've guarded it before." No one moved. The room felt smaller, the air too thick to swallow. Barnes rubbed the back of his neck, his hands slick with sweat. He wanted to speak, but the words didn't line up right. The distant hum of the engines was now joined by a staccato rhythm of boots' uniform steps, disciplined and deliberate. Elias finally looked at him again. "You see," he said softly, "you thought you were ending something today, but you were just starting it." The sirens outside cut off suddenly. Silence followed the kind that carries warning. Then came the faint echo of doors opening, orders, shouted the creak of the courthouse's front hinges. Barnes swallowed, eyes flicking to the phone still glowing on the table. The words hadn't vanished. "Incoming secure transmission." The governor's office was still calling. The sound outside swelled once more. A deep rumble, not chaos, not panic, just inevitability. I remember the way Hale turned to me, face pale, whispering, "The storm that started in silence is about to roar." And he was right, because somewhere above us the doors of that courthouse were about to open again, and this time justice was the one walking in. Outside, the air changed before anyone inside even knew why. The first thing you heard wasn't the sirens, it was the low growl of engines, deep and synchronized like thunder, rehearsing its entrance. Then the black cars appeared, long armored windows tinted to the color of command. Behind them, the pulse of helicopters thudded overhead, scattering dust across the courthouse steps. People pressed to the windows, phones up, whispers ricocheting through the marble halls. No one said the word governor out loud yet, but the name was already in the air, moving faster than the sound. In the courtroom, tension crawled over every seat. Lawyers half rose, unsure whether to stand or flee. Reporters whispered into their recorders' voices, trembling between awe and anticipation. The murmur built and broke in nervous waves until Judge Clarkson snapped quiet in this court. But even his voice sounded smaller than it had an hour ago. He looked toward the gallery doors, frowning, his hand tightening around the gavel. Why would the governor come for a case like this? He muttered mostly to himself. Barnes, seated near the prosecution table, tried to steady his breathing. He straightened his tie, then his collar, every motion too deliberate to hide the tremor in his hands. His jaw clenched and unclenched like he was chewing on fear. Deputy Hale stood by the side window, eyes fixed on the growing crowd outside. The reflection of flashing lights rippled across his uniform. "He's here," Hale whispered more to the room than anyone in particular. The words hit like a dropped glass. Everyone froze. Elias sat quietly in the defense chair, wrists still cuffed, posture unbroken. His gaze stayed on the floor for a beat, then lifted. Calm, knowing. "When truth walks in," he said softly, "lies scatter." No one replied. They couldn't. The sentence didn't ask for an answer. It simply rearranged the air. From the hallway came the sound boots against marble. Slow, heavy, too measured to belong to anyone ordinary. Every footstep echoed as if the building itself wanted to announce what was coming. You could feel it, justice, or something that pretended to be it, approaching with purpose. Judge Clarkson rose from his chair, his robe trembling faintly. "Bailiff," he said, voice breaking halfway through, "see what the commotion is." The bailiff didn't move. Neither did anyone else. The rhythm of those steps was hypnotic, drawing closer, each one louder, sharper, more certain. Barnes turned to Hale, whispering too harshly, "Tell me this isn't happening." Hale didn't answer. His eyes never left the doorway. Then, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of a door opening somewhere deeper in the building, a heavy door, the kind reserved for people who never have to knock. Voices followed, low, professional, giving directions. The hum of reporters outside grew louder. Every head in the courtroom tilted toward the sound. And then silence. Even the ceiling fan seemed to stop. The quiet that settled was so thick it carried its own weight, pressing against chests and throats, daring anyone to breathe. The footsteps started again, slower now, closer, a rhythm of inevitability. Barnes's face drained of color. He glanced toward the exit as if measuring the distance, calculating the escape. Hale caught his arm gently but firmly, as though to remind him there was nowhere left to run. The handle of the courtroom door shifted once, twice, and then paused. For a moment, even the light seemed to hesitate. Elias turned his head slightly toward the sound. His cuffs glinted in the fluorescent light, the faint trace of blood dried at his wrist. Yet his expression held no resentment, no fear, just quiet certainty. The door opened. The first person through wasn't the governor. It was one of his aides, earpiece and scanning the room like a soldier on sacred ground. Two state troopers followed, their presence alone rewriting the room's hierarchy. The judge's gavel slipped from his hand and rolled once across the desk before hitting the floor. Outside, a voice called, "Clear the aisle." And then those footsteps, steady, deliberate, entered the courtroom. The sound filled the space, swallowing every whisper, every breath. People didn't just hear it. They felt it deep in the chest, in the bones, in the memory of every wrong they'd watched unfold. The governor was close enough now that the air carried his cologne, faint and formal, like cedar and consequence. No one dared move. The narrator's voice came low and certain, each word spaced like heartbeats. Justice was coming not in words but in footsteps. And somewhere beneath that rising storm of silence, Elias Reed closed his eyes just once, just long enough to know that truth had finally found its way to the door. The door didn't so much open as declare itself. Two troopers cleared the threshold and aides scanned the room, and then he arrived, Governor Marcus Reed, tall, composed, a presence that straightened spines without saying a word. The room rose as one. Even the camera stood still. Air got heavy, not the kind that smothers, the kind that warns. Marcus let the silence measure him and then measured the room back. His eyes moved slowly across the benches, over the jury box that wasn't yet a jury, past the prosecution table where confidence had learned to whisper. When his gaze reached the defense chair, it stopped. On the cuffs, on the skin they marked, on the man wearing them. Elias didn't move. He didn't need to. The recognition between them traveled without noise. From the front row, Officer Barnes lurched to his feet, words tumbling out before he could stack them. "Sir, he was resisting arrest." Marcus's jaw tightened, the muscle rising once like a warning light. He took a single step forward. For a heartbeat, he said nothing, as if choosing which part of himself would speak, official, brother witness. When he did, each word was deliberate, cut from something harder than anger. Uncuff my brother. The room froze on the ellipsis. You could hear the word brother land heavy, precise, rearranging everything it touched. Deputy Hale moved first. He was already at Elias's side, fingers on the chain, key finding the lock with the certainty of a man rescuing a thing he'd been ashamed to hold. The cuffs sprang open. Metal fell away from skin. Elias flexed once, blood lifting, to meet freedom and set his hands in his lap as if they'd never left him. Barnes swallowed nothing. His mouth open-closed. The badge on his chest looked suddenly too shiny for the man wearing it. Elias rose, no grand gesture, just gravity with manners. He turned to Barnes, steady the whole room between them, narrowing to a single line. "You didn't just cuff me," he said. "You cuffed your own conscience." The sentence didn't shout. It settled. Somewhere, a reporter exhaled like a prayer. Hale stepped back, eyes lowered. Barnes stared at the floor as if it had betrayed him. Marcus advanced to the bench. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Authority, when it's honest, travels on the simplest current. "Your Honor," he said to Judge Clarkson, "this trial is hereby suspended. I'm reopening the entire investigation." Clarkson's color drained by degrees. His gavel lay where it had fallen earlier, as if it understood it no longer had a job. The judge's mouth worked before the words did. "Governor?" "I save your breath." Marcus cut in, not unkind, not soft. "You'll need it when you face the truth." No one clapped. No one dared. The troopers held the doorway like bookends. The aide touched his earpiece, said something into the air. Outside, the engines kept idling low, impatient, as if time itself were parked at the curb. Clarkson tried to find a higher ground inside his robe. "This is highly irregular," he managed. "So is putting a former federal prosecutor in cuffs during his own hearing," Marcus replied. He turned to letting the whole room witness his calm. "So is calling stillness resistance. So is confusing a badge with a verdict." The prosecutor rose halfway, then sat. Paper doesn't like being seen next to fire. Barnes took a step, then remembered there was nowhere to go that wasn't toward the truth. His voice came out smaller than his shoulders. "Sir, with respect." Marcus didn't look at him. He looked at Hale. "Deputy," he said evenly, "you will accompany Mr. Reed to a private conference room. Medical staff will meet you there. He is not to be restrained." "Yes," Governor Hale answered, relief and duty finding each other at last. Marcus's gaze came back to Clarkson. "All evidence relating to internal affairs case files under Reed's tenure will be transferred under executive seal pending independent review. Effective now." The court reporter stared at her hands as they kept up letters, catching history as it fell. Elias stood a fraction taller, like a man remembering his real height. He didn't touch Marcus. He didn't have to. The space between them was busy with what could be said later and what didn't need saying at all. Barnes tried again, reaching for the only rope left. "This can't be about politics," he said, as if naming the fear could cage it. "This isn't about politics," Marcus said without turning. "It's about proportion." He nodded at the abandoned cuffs on the table. "And perspective." A murmur rolled the length of the gallery and died when Marcus lifted his hand. He faced the room fully at last, the press, the public, the people who had come to watch law practiced like habit. "Let me be crystal clear," he said, the words clean as glass. "Whatever we were going to do here today, we are not doing it this way. Not in this building, not under my watch." He paused, and in that pause, I heard every hallway conversation that had ever excused a smaller wrong to avoid a larger inconvenience. I heard it shut off. "Mr. Reed," Marcus continued, "you will be examined and you will be heard. Not tomorrow. Today." He glanced at the aide. 10 minutes. Elias nodded once. The nod didn't thank anyone. It accepted an overdue fact. Clarkson looked around for allies and found only witnesses. He picked up the gavel out of habit and set it down out of respect. "This court will stand in recess," he said, the ritual reduced to a concession. The troopers shifted, clearing a path. Cameras remembered they were cameras and clicked, but softer now, as if learning manners. Marcus stepped back one pace, making room for the sunlight to reach where Elias was standing. Hale moved to Reed's shoulder, not to hold him, but to walk beside him. Barnes didn't move at all. I thought then about the first time I'd seen Elias in that doorway, wrists crossed, dignity asked to wait outside. And I understood something I should have known sooner. Power changes a room, but truth changes the temperature. We watched them turn toward the aisle. Governor Trooper's aide, Deputy Hale, and Elias Reed, unshackled, making an exit that felt more like an opening. The narrator in me finally found words even my bones agreed with. In that moment, power didn't walk in, justice did. The conference room was silent except for the hum of the projector. Sunlight bled through the blinds, cutting the space into pale stripes across the polished table. Governor Marcus Reed stood at the head, his expression carved from restraint. Across from him sat Judge Clarkson, pale and small in his chair. Officer Barnes stared down at his hands as if trying to erase the fingerprints of guilt. Marcus placed a black drive on the table. "Play it," he said. A click, then static, and then Barnes's voice. "We'll pin it on Reed. He won't survive this." It came out sharp, unmistakable. The room stopped breathing. Even the walls seemed to listen. Barnes blinked fast, his throat tightening. That's not what he couldn't finish. The sound of his own betrayal hung above him like smoke. Marcus turned toward Judge Clarkson, his tone calm, deliberate. "That's the voice of your witness, Judge." Clarkson's gavel hand trembled. He dropped his eyes to the floor, color draining from his face. I didn't know." "You didn't ask," Marcus said quietly. Across the table, Barnes sank into his chair, the weight of his actions finally heavy enough to crush him. He pressed both hands to his forehead, words spilling out broken. "He tried to protect me, and I destroyed him." The silence that followed was almost merciful, almost. Elias, seated across from him, met his eyes with calm so deep it felt unnatural. His wrists were free now, but his dignity had never really left him. His voice came low, steady, each word a mirror held up to conscience. "No, Barnes. You destroyed yourself the day you forgot who you swore to serve." Barnes shook his head, but the truth didn't move. He looked like a man drowning in water only ankle deep. Marcus leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. His voice filled the space, not loud but absolute. "The truth was always here. You just chose not to see it." No one spoke. The hum of the air conditioner suddenly sounded like judgment. Judge Clarkson took off his glasses, set them down, and rubbed his eyes. "I let bias sit on my bench," he whispered. "I let power dictate justice." Marcus didn't answer. He didn't need to. The room itself had already confessed. Elias finally stood, straightening his jacket. For the first time all day, he looked like what he had always been. Not the accused, but the teacher. He glanced toward the window, the sun painting the lines of his face. "Justice isn't about who speaks the loudest," he said softly. "It's about who's willing to stand when silence costs the most." A few of the clerks in the back shifted. One woman blinked away tears. The truth had weight, but it also had light, and for the first time it was filling the room. Barnes covered his face. "I thought I could bury it," he murmured. "Make it go away." Elias's tone stayed gentle. "You can't bury truth, Barnes. It's a seed. The deeper you hide it, the stronger it grows." Marcus turned off the projector. The last image froze on the screen, Barnes's file, time-stamped, undeniable. He looked around the room at the faces that had watched a man's life get twisted by a lie. "We rebuild from here," Marcus said. "Not just this case, our system, our conscience." Clarkson nodded, voice shaking. "Governor, I will tender my resignation immediately." Marcus shook his head. "Don't resign," he said. "Redeem. Fix what you broke. That's how we start." Barnes didn't lift his head. Elias reached for the cuffs that still sat on the table, placed them gently in front of him. "You might need these," he said quietly. "For yourself." The room went still again, but this time the silence felt lighter, like something sacred had been returned. I remember standing near the door, trying to breathe through the emotion. The truth hadn't just cleared a man's name, it had stripped the room bare of its excuses. Outside, the courthouse steps were already crowded. Word was spreading fast. Some people were crying, others were cheering, but everyone knew what had just happened. The narrator's voice settled low. Steady, final justice never fails, only men do. The air in the courtroom felt heavier than before, heavier but cleaner. Sunlight had found its way through the blinds, cutting across the floor, where the cuffs still lay glinting like broken promises. Governor Marcus Reed stood at the bench, now his voice steady, carrying the weight of both authority and exhaustion. Effective immediately, he said, all charges against Elias Reed are dismissed. The words rang like church bells. Each syllable hit the walls and came back louder. He paused, scanning the room. The officers who had once swaggered now shrank into their uniforms. Furthermore, Marcus continued, all law enforcement personnel involved in the falsification of evidence and unlawful detainment are hereby taken into custody pending investigation. The troopers at the door moved forward, quiet and deliberate. You could feel justice walking with them this time. Barnes stood slowly. His face had lost its arrogance. Now it just looked human, too human. He didn't resist when the troopers approached. He raised his hands, palms trembling. I don't deserve mercy, he said, voice raw. Elias turned toward him, his expression unreadable. Then softly, too soft for judgment, too firm for pity, he said, You don't need mercy, Barnes. You need truth. The line hung there like a verdict written in the air. Barnes nodded once, almost grateful for the sentence. He didn't speak again. The cuffs clicked around his wrists, a faint echo of irony. Marcus watched, his jaw set but his eyes distant. Then he turned to his brother. Elias, he said quietly, what should be done with him? Elias looked at Barnes for a long time, long enough for everyone to realize this wasn't about vengeance. His tone was calm, deliberate, as if he'd been holding the answer for years. He doesn't need a prison, he said. He needs a mirror. The line rippled through the courtroom, silent first, then deep. It wasn't just about Barnes anymore. It was about every man who'd chosen power over principle. For a moment, even Marcus's composure cracked. He exhaled, the kind of breath you take when carrying something heavier than yourself. At the side of the room, Deputy Hale stepped forward. His voice came out rough with guilt. Sir, I should have stopped him. Marcus turned, his expression softening. Then start now, he said, by doing right. Hale nodded. No salute, no words, just a quiet understanding. Some debts are repaid in deeds, not apologies. From the back of the courtroom, a voice broke the silence. It was Mr. Hollis, the old defense lawyer whose silver hair caught the light like time itself. He pushed himself up from the bench, leaning on his cane. I've served this court 40 years, he said, voice trembling but proud, and today I finally saw justice. For a moment, nobody moved. Then somewhere near the gallery, a pair of hands began to clap. Slow, respectful, one beat then another. Soon the sound grew like a wave, gaining strength. Not thunderous applause, but the kind that carries gratitude more than celebration. Elias didn't smile. He simply bowed his head, once a small acknowledgement of a truth long delayed. Marcus placed a hand on his shoulder, not as a governor, but as a brother who had almost lost more than family. Judge Clarkson stayed seated, eyes glassy, his gavel untouched. For the first time, he looked not like a man of power, but a man learning humility. As the applause faded, the narrator's voice rose quiet and certain. Forgiveness didn't erase the past. It built a bridge to the future. The room began to empty, officers leading the guilty out, journalists whispering into their recorders, people hugging strangers who had wept beside them. Through the tall courthouse windows, the day had changed. The storm clouds had finally begun to break apart, light cutting through in streaks that looked almost intentional. Elias walked toward the exit, unhurried, his steps echoing softly down the corridor. Behind him, the sound of those fading claps followed, not applause for victory, but for endurance. Justice, it seemed, had finally stood up. And for the first time in a long while, no one dared tell it to sit down. Evening came like mercy, slow, golden, forgiving. The courthouse doors opened and Elias Reed stepped out beside his brother. The air outside felt lighter, as if the building itself had exhaled after holding its breath all day. Sunlight spilled over the wide stone steps, warm and unfiltered, catching on the polished brass of the courthouse seal behind them. For the first time in hours, no one shouted, no gavel struck. The sound that replaced it was softer, the hum of cameras, the rustle of notepads, the collective inhale of a world that had just watched truth crawl its way back into daylight. A young reporter, microphone trembling slightly in her hand, broke the silence. Mr. Reed, she asked, how does it feel to be free again? Elias stopped halfway down the steps, the wind stirring the edge of his jacket. He didn't rush his answer. His voice, calm and measured, carried enough gravity to still the noise. Freedom isn't the absence of chains, he said. It's the presence of truth. The words landed with quiet power. Even the cameras seemed to lower their gaze. Marcus stood a step behind, watching his brother as if seeing him for the first time, not as the man who had been wronged, but as the man who had endured it without losing himself. He moved closer, his tone low, almost private. "You still believe in this system?" Elias looked at him, that faint, knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Not in the system," he said. "In the people still trying to fix it." Marcus nodded, eyes glistening, but proud. It wasn't just brotherhood between them. Now it was something larger, the silent vow of two men who had seen the same broken machine from opposite sides and still chose not to walk away. From across the plaza, a familiar figure stood apart from the crowd. Barnes no longer in uniform. His badge was gone, his posture smaller, stripped of arrogance. He watched them without moving. For the first time, his face held no defiance, only recognition. Slowly, he removed his cap and lowered his head. No words, no excuses. Just a gesture, simple, heavy enough. Near the edge of the courthouse steps, the black woman who had cried out during the arrest earlier stood watching, tears still wet on her cheeks. She clasped her hands, whispering to no one in particular. Finally, someone listened. Her voice trembled, but it wasn't sadness anymore. It was relief, the kind that comes after too many years of silence. Behind them, the courthouse doors opened once more. Judge Clarkson emerged, his robe draped loosely around his shoulders, the weight of the day still visible in his eyes. He paused beside them, cleared his throat, and said quietly, "Justice learned something today." Marcus gave a curt nod. Elias turned toward him, and for a moment no one spoke. The world didn't need to. Elias looked back at the courthouse, the marble columns, the flag above, the carved words across the facade. "In God we trust." He'd walked past that phrase 100 times in his career, but only now did he understand it in full. He smiled, not out of triumph, but gratitude, the kind that belongs to survivors, not winners. The camera flash caught that smile. It wasn't rehearsed. It was real. He turned slightly toward the reporters, still waiting, his voice soft but clear. "Justice isn't written in laws," he said. "It's written in those who refuse to give up on it." And that was it. No grand speech, no curtain call. Just truth, standing taller than the walls that had tried to contain it. Marcus placed a hand on his brother's shoulder. Together they descended the courthouse steps. The crowd parted without being asked. Some clapped. Some simply watched, eyes wet, hearts full. The sun hung low now, setting behind the courthouse dome, painting everything in gold. As the two men reached the last step, the sound of applause grew faint, replaced by something more profound. Silence, deep and reverent. Barnes remained where he was, still holding his cap. The woman wiped her tears. Clarkson lingered at the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dying light. For a brief, perfect second, they were all connected, not by verdicts or power, but by the fragile, redemptive truth of what had just happened. And then as the last light faded, the narrator's voice came in one final time, low and resolute. "Justice isn't written in laws. It's written in those who refuse to give up on it." Music began to rise, slow piano strings like a heartbeat finding rhythm again. The screen darkened, but the warmth of that moment stayed behind, glowing softly. Across the black screen, white letters appeared, inspired by true stories of silent strength. And with that, the story ended, not with a victory, but with a promise. And that's the story, my friends, a reminder that justice isn't just about laws or titles. It's about courage, compassion, and the will to stand for what's right, even when the world goes silent. If this story moved you, if it made you think, or simply reminded you that truth still matters, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Mr. Max Stories for more powerful tales that speak to the heart. Every click, every comment, every share helps our small creative team keep doing what we love, bringing you stories that honor dignity, resilience, and hope. At Mr. Max Stories, we believe that every voice matters, every truth deserves light, and every act of courage creates ripples that never fade. Thank you for listening, and remember, justice lives on when we choose to keep telling the stories that matter.